Moisture in compressed air. Yeah, if you got it, it's a problem, and you got to get it out of there if you're gonna, particularly if you're gonna spray automotive paint. There's a lot of opinions and information out on the internet about what you've got to do to get rid of moisture. 50 feet copper this, air dryer that. Some of those opinions, some of that information is correct for that person at their location for what they're doing, but it may not be correct for your location, the tools you're using, and what you're doing. So understanding the physics of how does moisture get into air and how does it come out is really important before you move into the solution, because once you understand it, the solution may be simpler than some of the explanations out there based on your location, your tools, and what you're doing. So we're going to jump into it here. Right after a quick word from our sponsor. Black Diamond professional grade sanding blocks. They're both flexible and adjustable with a ergonomic rubber handle, a polycarbonate base that gets things really flat, and rods you can put in to adjust the thickness. So whether you're shaping filler, blocking down primer, or doing your final cut buff color correction, Black Diamond blocks are the tool to help you get professional, outstanding results faster, easier, and better. BlackDiamondBlocks.com. All right, moisture in compressed air. Let's dig into it. So if you got a 60-gallon tank on your compressor, compressed air from the atmosphere compresses about 10 times at 125 psi. So your 60-gallon tank contains about 600 gallons of air at atmospheric pressure. So your compressor compresses it 10 times, 600 gallons of air get compressed down into a 60-gallon tank, and that is the air and the moisture in the air getting compressed. So how much moisture is in 600 gallons of compressed air? Well, it absolutely depends on where you are. Geographical location and the climate of that location makes a tremendous difference. Let's look at two locations. Colorado Springs, and so in Colorado Springs, it's a pretty dry climate actually. And so when you compress 600 gallons of air into a 60-gallon tank, you have about a tablespoon of water in that air. Typically, depends on the season and all that, but on average, you're going to have about a tablespoon of water from 600 gallons of compressed air. Now, if you look over at Mississippi, that same 600 gallons compressed into 60 gallons is going to have 3 times more water, about 3 tablespoons of water on a typical day. That's a lot more water, 3 times more water. And that absolutely matters when it comes to how much water comes out of your gun or your tool and what you need to do about it. So here is a rough moisture climate zone map of the U.S. with 4 distinct, kind of categories. And you can see the West Coast is kind of moderate for the most part, and that'd be west of the Cascade Range, or in Northern California, west of the Sierra Nevadas. The mountain states is dry for the most part. The Midwest, moderate. And then as you get to the East Coast, it's humid. And then the Gulf Coast, very humid. So where you are at makes a tremendous difference. And let's look at weather.com to just see some interesting stuff. So here is weather.com for the city where I live, Olympia, Washington, just south of Seattle. And you can see right at the moment, the humidity is listed as 54%. That's relative humidity. And the dew point is listed at 52%. This is the number we care about. Relative humidity is a confusing measure. And it's so warm air holds more moisture than cold air. So relative humidity is saying for this given temperature, right, how full is the air? And, we compare it, we could say in Olympia right now, because the temperature's low, it's 69 degrees, the air can hold a thimble full of water, for like a room, right? And it's saying that thimble is 54% full, about half full. Now let's look over at Houston. Okay, Houston right now is hot. It's right at 98 degrees. It feels like 108 because it's very humid, but the relative humidity is 45%. So at that temperature, warmer air holds more moisture. They're saying, hey, this air could hold a cup of water, and that cup is 45% full, but the dew point is 72 degrees. So the Houston air has a lot more moisture in it. So this relative humidity number is confusing. Dew point is what we care about. That's how much moisture is actually in the air. Now, we've all seen this dew point in action, and I think here's a great illustration, right? You go pull a can of your favorite beverage out of the refrigerator, and most times, most locations, you're going to get some condensation on the outside of the can. And a typical refrigerator is at 37 degrees. So in Seattle, if that can were at 52 degrees, it would have condensation on it. At 52 and below, anything above that, it wouldn't have condensation. In Houston, if that can were at 72 degrees, it would be forming condensation at 72 and below, not above it. That's a huge difference. And, 72 degrees is a pretty warm beverage. So that's the difference. And that's dew point, the temperature at which moisture leaves the air and begins to condensate into droplets. So now, finally, let's talk about what goes on inside your compressor. So, your compressor is basically a 4-stroke air pump. It's like a gasoline engine, but there's no fuel, there's no explosion. So on the intake stroke, the piston goes down, the intake valve is open, and the compressor draws in air from the atmosphere. Air molecules and moisture molecules. Whatever moisture is in the air gets pulled in with the air, and that depends on how much moisture is in the air based on your location. And then here's where it gets interesting. On the compression stroke, the air and the moisture get compressed, and just a fact of physics, when air is compressed, it gets heated, actually a lot. It can be from 175 even up to 300, depending on the how much compression is taking place. But that's a lot. From an ambient air temperature of 70 degrees, all of a sudden it's 200 degrees. That's a dramatic and radical increase in temperature in the air. So the air and the moisture is now compressed, and it's hot. And it's also worth noting that when the air is still in the cylinder and it's compressed and it's hot, the moisture in the air is still in a vapor form only, no water droplets, vapor. And then the exhaust valve opens, and the hot compressed air then flows into the tank. And you can see the cutaway of a tank here. And this is thing that's, I think, confusing to people, is that your air tank is actually the first stage and one of the most important stages of moisture removal, because you got this hot air, call it 200 degrees, entering the tank. And, a 60-gallon tank is like 100 pounds of steel. It's got a big thermal mass, and it's sitting there at room temperature. And your 200-degree air comes in, and it hits the walls of that tank. And so here's some more cool science and physics at work. We talked about dew point, and, Houston, the dew point was 72. When you compress air, in the tank, it's 10x, 600 gallons into 60 gallons. Its ability to hold water is reduced. The molecules are closer together. And so pressure increases the dew point dramatically. And so if the tank is at 125 psi, that raises the dew point to 140 degrees. That's the temperature at which the the air will begin to lose the water, right? It can't hold it. It comes out. And so if your tank is sitting in your shop at an ambient temperature of 70 degrees, 80 degrees, even 90 degrees, and maybe it's getting warm from the thing running, right? It's nowhere near 140 degrees. So when that air comes out of the compressor and hits your tank, it sheds a ton of water, and moisture in the air, hits its dew point and begins condensing and running down the walls on the inside of the tank. Now, it depends on how much moisture is in the air and, the ambient temperature, how cool the tank is. And of course, with use, the tank is going to begin to heat up, and then less moisture will come out. But it's an important stage of moisture removal, and that's why you have water in the bottom of your tank. And here's one more bit of trivia you might find interesting. We hear constantly, hey, you need to drain the water out of your tank, and that is an important maintenance task. But the reason we drain water out of the tank is for corrosion, protection. We don't want the water rusting the tank, and we don't want the tank to fill up and ultimately at some point begin to lose storage capacity and its ability to cause the moisture to condense and run out of the water. The water in the bottom of your tank is not going to magically become vapor and head back out down your airline as moisture. It's been removed from the air and it's sitting there, and it's not going back in the air. And it seems like there's a bit of confusion about small compressors versus large. And, I've seen comments that, smaller compressors make more moisture. Well, no compressor makes moisture. Moisture is in the air. It comes into the compressor. But the true statement is a bigger tank removes more moisture. A smaller tank just doesn't have the storage, the thermal mass, the air's not in there as long. So, small compressors don't create more moisture, they just remove less. And then finally we get to the complete system, right? We've got the compressor, air's going into the tank, some moisture's being removed within the tank, and then it's going to go through, your airlines and through whatever components you've got in your air system, a water separator, a valve, whatever there is. And then it goes through an air hose and it gets to the tool at the end. And depending on how much moisture is in the air and the actual air temperature and how much the air cools going through that system, then you may or may not get moisture coming out of the tool, the air gun in this picture. So moisture removal is all about designing a system that cools the air to the point that it will give up its moisture and then has some means of collecting that moisture before it makes it to the tool. So in my next video, I'm going to talk about moisture removal system designs and offer 4 different, kind of starting point designs for different climates and different use cases. But I hope you found that helpful because, again, understanding the physics of how moisture gets into the air and what makes it come out is really important before we go try to address the problem. Okay? Thanks.